What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon, DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance Crew, and you are watching DaVinci Reacts. Today we're going to be getting into a very interesting video. This was a video that was done by the Infographics show, or the Infographics channel. I will have a link for their channel at the end of this video. An icon will pop up over here. You click on it, it'll take you to their channel. You can like, subscribe, all the other good stuff. I will also have a link for the original video in the description box down below. If you click it, it will take you and you can watch it without having to worry about me pausing and talking over it. You can also, like if you're a reactor, you can do a reaction to it yourself. That's the link that you will use to get that video. And if you want to be a nice person and watch the original before you watch the reaction, that is the link you will use. You have plenty of time. You can do it right now. You can pause my video, go watch the original first, and then come back and watch it with me. And then critique all the stuff that I missed that you pretend like you saw the first time you saw it, but you didn't. So you can pretend you're mightier than me because you saw something coming, and I didn't. So I know that you people out there on YouTube do that shit, because sometimes I do it. Don't pretend like you don't, because I know you. And let's go ahead and jump into this, see what it has to offer. This video is called What If? World Without the US Part 1. I will likely have a Part 2 out maybe sometime, not tomorrow. I have a lot to record tomorrow, so maybe the day after tomorrow. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and it is something that I would like to talk about more, but I'll probably have to talk about it through the video because I've already talked a lot as of right now. Maybe I'll talk about it more afterwards, but we'll see. Let's jump into it.
When you're popular, everyone loves to hate you. And if you're American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that deserve being hated for. And if you're not American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that it deserves being loved for. Yet, as the world's sole superpower, the US's influence spreads around the world, in both good and bad ways. What would happen, though, if the US didn't exist anymore? Or at least if its influence across the world stage disappeared overnight? World War II ends.
I think that Europe would probably be a little bit more unstable. I think that China would be pretty much governing the world right now. Well, China and Russia. I think maybe tensions wouldn't have been as... Well, actually, I take that back. Tensions would have been worse with China and Russia, because Russia would have been the world superpower. They probably wouldn't have to worry so much about their military budget, so they wouldn't collapse as fast. But China still has an economy that is allowing it to leapfrog other countries until it eventually threatens to become number one. At that point, you have some type of competition between Russia and China, maybe even extends as far as being like a new Cold War or a different Cold War. And I don't know. I guess it depends on who's willing to be the most, like which nation is willing to be the most open. Because the one that sticks solely to communism is going to fall. The one that can embrace all aspects of like socialism as well as some capitalism and some other stuff, that's going to be the one to succeed.
At least if its influence across the world stage disappeared overnight. World War II ends in a stalemate. Armchair historians love to point out that the moment Hitler invaded Russia, he was doomed to failure, and thus World War II would have been won by the Allies even without the US. Yet historical truth is not quite that simple. Invading Russia was a critical mistake made by Hitler, and one worsened when the US joined the war and reopened the Western Front in Europe. Yet, what if the US had simply shrugged its shoulders when Russia and Britain begged it to join the war effort? Despite a superior fleet, Britain's war material supply was running dangerously low, even with constant American resupply efforts. Without the US to ship war goods to Britain, the best that the United Kingdom could have done is stave off a German invasion. Wait
a minute, hold up, time out. If we're talking about a world without the US, we're talking about a world where the US was never founded, right? If that's the case, they wouldn't have to worry about the US sending them supplies, because they would be the country with the supplies. They would have control over North America. So they wouldn't have to worry about the United States shipping anything, because they would just be shipping it to themselves. The UK would be in control of, if not most of North America. So yeah, I think that without the United States, they would have been fine. Britain would have still been a lot more, it would have been more powerful than it was in our timeline. Because like I said, they would have had control over a lot of the colonies they had in New World would have still been under their control, I think. There would have been, I mean, it would have been better because Hitler would have known what to do. He would have probably tried to still go over the English Channel and try to, bomb the UK and everything. But at this point, the UK would have had like a little summer home that it can like run off to if need be. The situation wouldn't have been as dire, I don't believe, had they still had control of the colonies in North America. Like a lot of, like even if the French was still had a presence in North America, they would have been in a more powerful position than they would have been. Germany would have been almost the exact same. Like there would have been no real difference between like Germany as far as like the territories they controlled and stuff like that. They would have been in the exact same position. So yeah, I think that this person is, maybe they're thinking about it from like if America stopped existing during World War II or something. I don't know.
To ship war goods to Britain, the best that the United Kingdom could have done is stave off a German invasion. In war games carried out in the early 2000s by a British think tank, it was discovered that Hitler could never have successfully overcome Britain's fleets, the RAF, or the Home Guard in a cross-channel invasion. Yet this war game was undertaken with constant US resupply efforts underway. Without these resupply efforts, a cross-channel invasion would probably still have been disastrous for Germany, but then again, Germany would have had little need to invade Britain without the US supplying it. A token defensive force could have been left behind in France in order to discourage British invasion, and the full might of the Wehrmacht could have been dispatched to the Eastern Front, not just reviled as a madman and...
I don't know. You really think that Britain would have been discouraged by a small fleet of Germans in France? Really? Really? Yeah, that wouldn't have happened. That would not have happened. They still wouldn't have surrendered in the other timeline. They still would have tried to take it directly to them. And like I said, they would have had control of the colonies in North America, so they would have still been able to ship supplies to themselves. So I don't know. I think this is way too simplified.
Mass murderer. Stalin was also famously a very poor strategic thinker. He was so surprised by Hitler's invasion that in the years leading up to it, he had taken almost zero precautions against German hostility. To make matters worse, his political purges prior to World War II had decimated the ranks of the Red Army and eliminated most of its experienced commanders. Despite having exponentially greater numbers and firepower advantage in the Winter War of 1939 against Finland, the smaller and much more poorly equipped Finnish army managed to absolutely decimate the Red Army before overwhelming numbers alone forced a defeat. By the time of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, little had improved in the Red Army in the way of command and control, logistical support, or even training. When Hitler invaded, his troops quickly seized many of the Soviet Union's agricultural regions, leaving the nation to face mass starvation if it hadn't been for the US's Lend-Lease aid program to the wartime allies, providing food, raw materials, tanks, planes, ammunition, clothing, and everything in between. The United States provided critical aid to the Soviet Union in its most desperate hour.
Now the question is, would Russia have been as relaxed if the United States weren't a presence in the world? Like, maybe the reason. Well, I ain't gonna speculate because I don't know, and I don't know enough about the situation to like say anything about it, but would they have been a little more cautious if they had known that Britain was the last obstacle in the situation? Like, did Russia know that the United States would potentially step in the event that like Britain like fell? I don't know if they would have or they wouldn't have, but maybe Stalin did, and that's why he thought like they weren't going to attack him for at least a certain amount of time. I don't know. It just seems like this. First of all, the question of like, what if a world without the United States is already a big ass like question. There are so many variables in this situation that it's almost impossible to know what could have happened. Like, the range of possibilities is way too wide to really speculate. So I really have to wonder, like, I want to know what their scenario is. Like, did the United States exist and then disappear? Did the United States never exist? Because at that point, we have to go back hundreds of years and talk about, like, different geopolitical things that happened that don't happen in this new scenario, or things that didn't happen in our world that does happen in the new scenario. Like, I don't know. It just seems way too easy to say, oh, you know, World War II would have been a lot harder to win had the United States not been involved. Because for all we know, World War II could have been easier to win. Because like I said, if the UK had control over its American colonies and territories, they would have had more resources to send to them, to the mainland, to defend against Hitler. And because they were already going to war from day one, they could have taken all those resources and just, like, all that extra manpower, and just, like, took a full Allied invasion straight to them from the beginning. There might have not even been a Dunkirk, maybe, if they had control over the North American country or continent, because they would have had control of the continent. They had Canada. They would have gotten the territories in the United States. I don't know how much territory Mexico might have had, if they still would have had California or not. If England or if the UK were, like, thought about purchasing those areas from, like, France, and they did decide to fight Mexico for the Western United States, they would have had all the raw resources that the U.S. had. So, yeah, it just seems like way too quick of a answer to say, oh, well, you know, they would have been.
The United States provided critical aid to the Soviet Union in its most desperate hour. American raw materials fueled Soviet factories that churned out tanks, and thousands of Studebaker trucks helped move goods around the nation and its troops to the front lines. Warm winter clothing kept Soviet soldiers from freezing to death, and American rations fed both soldiers and civilians alike. As Soviet General Georgy Zhukov said after World War II, "We didn't have explosives, gunpowder. We didn't have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives. And how much sheet steel they gave us. How could we have produced our tanks without American steel? But now they make it seem as if we had an abundance of all that. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." Immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the United States gave the nation an interest-free loan of $1 billion, or about $17.5 billion in today's dollars, worth of supplies and raw materials. The United Kingdom was also given an initial lease of between 40 and 50 destroyers. Per the terms of the Lend-Lease, the materials were lent for the duration of the war and expected to be returned or reimbursed only upon war's end if they were kept for civilian use. Any combat losses would not be expected to be repaid. Basically, the U.S. lent the Allies surplus military equipment under the condition that it didn't have to be repaid for unless it was kept after the war was over. In total, the U.S. gave the Soviet Union 44,000 jeeps, 375,883 trucks, 8,071 tractors, 12,700 tanks, 1,541,590 blankets, 331,066 liters of alcohol, 15,417,000 pairs.
I know y'all hated the alcohol because American alcohol, from what I understand, sucks. Enjoy your watered down alcohol,
of military boots, 106,893 tons of cotton, 2,670,000 tons of petroleum products and fuel, and 4,478,000 tons of food. It's clear that without the U.S., the best the Allies could have hoped for would have been a stalemate, with Germany holding on to the richest parts of the Soviet Union and expelling Britain off the mainland. No European Union. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, Europe found itself in shambles. Nearly all of its financial and industrial networks had been destroyed in the fierce fighting, and entire national economies had collapsed. The war had been the most devastating in human history, and the fate of entire nations hung by a thread. 2.5 years after the end of fighting, there was very little sign of recovery from the European mainland, with millions of homeless homeless and out of work. Then, in 1948, the U.S. Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, drafted up a 4-year plan meant to reinvigorate the European economy. The plan would rely on $15 billion of financial aid, or $250 billion in today's dollars, and it would be completely financed by the American taxpayer. The first target of the Marshall Plan, as it came to be known, would be feeding the European population, as a massive famine was threatening the mainland. Thus, food aid was immediately dispatched to 16 European nations. The Soviet Union and its satellite states had been offered assistance as well, but it had turned it down due to fears of meddling by the U.S. in internal affairs. The main focus of the Marshall Plan was on the recovery of Europe's largest industrial powers, such as West Germany, France, and Great Britain, as it was believed that if these great economies were jump-started, then the effects would spread to other nations. Attempts to rebuild national shipping fleets, road and railway infrastructure, and reconstruct devastated cities were bolstered by American aid money, though the effect of the Marshall Plan is likely less economic and more political. Due to the Soviet Union's refusal to partake in any reconstruction efforts, the Marshall Plan and the 16 nations it aided helped establish the political framework for what post-World War II Europe would look like, with the West firmly aligned in solidarity against the Communist East. The Marshall Plan seeded the idea of European unity and fostered an intertwining of European interests, which was President Truman's greatest goals, as only a unified Europe could stand against the Soviet Union. But also, only a unified Europe could avert another world war. Without the Marshall Plan, European economies would have taken longer to recover than they did, which would have made them more vulnerable to political revolutions fostered by the Soviet Union, whose agents were constantly at work attempting to make the ideology of Soviet revolution abroad or of spreading communist revolutions around the world a reality. The Marshall Plan, however, also laid down the political and economic roots for what would become the European Union. And without it, it's very likely that Europe would have returned to the old power way of thinking that had dominated European politics for centuries. European colonialism prevailed.
Now, I don't know anything about like the European Union and everything, because I know that there's a lot of stuff going on as far as like people want, like, whether they want to be in the European Union or whether they want to be out of the European Union. All I know is the idea of an overarching government that allows everybody to, or at least is supposed to allow everybody to have a say in different type of diplomatic issues. You don't have to worry about going to war. There's another alternative way of settling it. All of you come together, so you don't want to see someone else fail or do something negative, because it will negatively impact you as well. I think that's a good way to go. I think that, like, people talk about like globalism and this, that, and the other. Personally, I have no problem with globalism. I think that the more open people are to each other, the better the world will be, personally. I think the second you start drawing lines and separating yourself from other people, that's when the tribalistic us versus them starts to come into effect. And once you start to get that mindset, that's how people are able to justify doing all the atrocities that we've seen in this world, because it's like, oh, they're not like us, or they're different, so they're not the same. And then that ends up evolving into they're not on our level, they're not the same, like we're better than them, we're a higher people than them, and then that stretches over to, oh, they're inferior to us, and we can do whatever we want to them, and like that. It always steeps into that type of mindset because people are stupid, and that's just how people tend to like, that's the mindset people fall into over time. But personally, I don't have a problem with like governments getting together for like the idea of like helping each other out. Personally, if it were up to me, which it's not, because I have no intention of ever running for politics, because I think a lot of you people are stupid. But if it were up to me, I would have an overarching body over each continent. So you'd have like a North American Union, a South American Union, an African Union, a European Union, an Asian Union, and I guess the oceanic countries could probably jump into the European Union. And I would have that as one thing. And then I would have the United Nations as an even higher overarching authority that has actual authority with their own fighting force and everything, but no one country has overwhelming influence over it. Like, everybody has a say, but it's I try to think of some way so that there's no way that some one body or one group can get too much influence and can start exerting their will on the UN and just have them do whatever they want. But that's my own personal fantasy fairy dream. Like, the idea that that will work perfectly, I don't know, because chances are you can't underestimate people's greed or thirst for power. So, but in an idealistic world, that's
thinking that had dominated European politics for centuries. European colonialism prevails. Prior to World War II, European powers retained colonies across the world, and upon entering the Second World War, President Roosevelt made it extremely clear to the Allies that America's help was dependent on the eventual liberation of the majority of these colonial holdings.
I don't know about that, because if that were the case, then the United States wouldn't have been doing the same thing. I don't know. It seems like it's a bit of a hot take. I would probably take that one back. The United States was damn sure not going around trying. Well, then again, we were preaching the land of the free while being a slave country. So who knows? It's probably within America's history to be 100% hypocritical like that. But yeah, in his scenario, the colonial thing still happened. So I don't know why they would think that World War II would just be a stalemate.
With their feet to the fire, Britain and France were forced to agree. And after the end of the war, President Truman made it a top priority to ensure that Britain and France, as well as other European powers, held true to their promises to begin liberating their colonies. Though the process was slow, the end of colonialism was much the result of the economic collapse of Europe's great powers, as it was the sheer determination of American presidents to see Europe relinquish its old ways. Without the United States, European colonialism would have continued, and may in fact have worsened. With their economies in shambles, European powers would have leaned even harder on their colonial states, bleeding their economies dry in an effort to rebuild themselves.
That would have just led to revolution, and the people would have either, like, if the colonial powers weren't willing to let go, then they would have just rebelled. Like, that's how it works. It's not like they were in a position to, like, defend themselves from all this after World War II. If anything, that would have been the prime moment that most of those places would have, like,
this would have sparked violent insurgencies around the world, which would have brought with them harsh crackdowns by the colonial powers. In the end, the death of European colonialism would have taken decades more to arrive, and the world today may in fact look a lot more like it did during the age of the great powers. Korea unified under the North, and Japan rises as an imperial power once more. Today, South Korea is a vibrant and prosperous nation, while its neighbor to the north is facing mass starvation and economic desolation. Yet the entire Korean peninsula would look very different today if it were not for the U.S. 2 days after the start of the war, the UN published Resolution 83, urging UN members to lend military aid to the South. A UN coalition force was ultimately formed, but it was the U.S. that would do the heavy lifting. The war would end 3 years later after China's involvement, with the U.S. not desiring to see the situation evolve into another major war that would now include China. If the U.S. had not been available to defend the South, the war would have been won by the North far too quickly for the UN to marshal a sizable military response.
Again, we don't know, because it's like, if it wasn't the U.S., it would have been somebody else. And given how much resources and area that the UK had, it probably would have been the UK. Yeah, because you gotta, like I said, you gotta go all the way back. The reason why the colonies rebelled was because the UK started taxing the hell out of them, and that was because of the fact that they lost so much money during the 7 Years' War. So, in this scenario, the colonies would have just paid the UK the extra taxes. They would have recovered, and they would have had a lot. They probably would have, like, started industrializing earlier and everything. Like, who knows how much further advanced the UK would have been if the United States wasn't there for that rebellion and everything else. How many resources they would have had in North America that they could use for different things. They probably would have gotten rid of a lot of colonies that they had control of that they didn't necessarily need. They would have been the ones to been the main force of the UN. Hell, half the damn UN would have been them. Like, just the British Empire, just the UN is like half the UN is the British Empire. So it's not too far-fetched to just say, okay, we got half the world, we'll just let, you know, the other half come in and, you know, try to have a say in everything, but we'll do the heavy lifting for these things. Yeah, like, who knows? Like, who knows if Britain would have had more control in China too? Like, who knows how, like, the Opium Wars and everything else could have gone if the United States weren't there. So that means that Britain has more leverage over China, which could have led them to influencing China to interfere or not interfere in the Korean War. Or, like, there's just too many things. Like, so many things to...
And the entire peninsula would have been reunited under the North. Communism would have overtaken the South, and while we may be tempted to compare the fate of a communist peninsula with that shared by the North today, it's important to remember that the state of the North's economy is largely the result of US-led sanction efforts against the Kim regime. Without the US to lead these sanctions and under the protection of a growing China, the unified Korean peninsula would be in a stronger economic state than the North is today. If it would have been more prosperous than South Korea is today is debatable, but what isn't is that a communist Korea wouldn't necessarily be as impoverished as the North is today.
Well, it depends. If there was like a Cold War of some kind going on, then it would have been. If not, then they probably wouldn't have had as much of a reason to invest so heavily into their military, because, again, if there was no Cold War with the United States, they wouldn't have had the need to feel like they needed to defend themselves. Plus, with no South Korea, they wouldn't have had a need to feel like there was an enemy on their doorstep. They would have just been them and China, and Russia would have been one of the superpowers in the world. The UK doesn't really have any influence in Korea, so they wouldn't have had as much of a need to, like, do that. Like, for all we know, Korea probably might not have even gotten nuclear weapons. They probably would have just been investing into their economy. Probably close to like a smaller version of China.
Communist Korea would have naturally gravitated toward China and become a satellite state. This would have upended Asian politics as we understand them today. Japan, for one, would have been quick to ditch its pacifist ideologies, which were only ever truly possible as a result of Japan enjoying the protection of the United States. Faced with a hostile China, Japanese nationalistic hardliners would have upended the constitution and rewritten it to allow Japan to once more field a military capable of both offensive and defensive operations.
Again, we're talking about like you're taking it very literal with the United States not being there, because yes, the United States took control of Japan and like helped rebuild it, but if the United States didn't, then all that would have happened was the same thing that happened to Germany. It would have just been split between allies. And, well, first of all, if it ended in a stalemate, then Japan wouldn't have technically lost anything, right? Maybe they would have gotten closer connections with Russia, or if they still felt like some type of way with Germany, they would have ended up gravitating towards the Allies. Who knows? But maybe Japan might have fallen into communism. Don't know. But yeah, I think, like I said, it's too. It just seems like this.
Even
is very
today,
simplified.
Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is a member of a right-wing nationalistic party, which in the past advocated a return to imperial power. Japan would have risen as a military power once more, and conflict in Asia would be all but unavoidable. The second half of the 20th century would have been dramatically different without U.S. intervention, and it's likely that communism would have dominated the global stage both militarily and politically, whereas today we live in a world of mostly strong democratic states. We could in fact have seen a reverse of this, with the world as we know it being made up of a collection of communist states where the democracies are the minority. What would that have meant for global civil rights movements? We can only guess, but in part 2, we'll take a look at how the world may have looked as it entered the 21st century in a world without the US. What do you think would have happened to post-war Europe without the US? What would the world look like today? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can catch part 2 of What If World Without US.
Yeah, see, I'm gonna have to go and look up the other. I'm gonna have to look up the comments to see what people say about it, because I feel like this is way too simplified. Let's go to the comments real quick. Let's see. If America wasn't there, then the aliens wouldn't have a place to attack. Okay, that's technically true. Well, they would have probably just attacked like Big Ben, and I think the Eiffel Tower would have been the symbol of destruction in almost all the movies and stuff. When I first thought after seeing the title, well, Canada will probably become a continent. American history will be a lot easier. True. People would have gotten a lot more straight A's in social studies in America. When you are given alcohol to the Soviet Union, you know they are suffering. Let's see. America doesn't exist. Everything after American Revolution is different. Let's see more on this one. That's actually very interesting you mentioned that. One of the major influences of the French Revolution was the new country that had just gone through a revolution and inspired the population. True. That would be the same with every country. Butterfly effect. Well, I don't know about that. Some butterfly effects are bigger than others. Before the revolution, there was no America, so nothing changes. You're right. Everyone would be speaking German instead of English right now. Would have Spanish is the main language. How the United States would still be a British colony. Yeah. Okay, I think it's coming out of my window. I was about to say, I feel like I hear dogs barking or something. I don't know where the hell it's coming from. I heard it on my mic before I heard it outside. Childish Gambino would not have released This Is America. Well, he would have been, but it would have just been in like an English accent. If the U.S. is gone, my country would still be Spain's colony. Let's see, the question no one asked, what is the United States' turn to Germany's side? When you fight in World War I and World War II, but no one acknowledges you, cries in Anzac. See, I don't know what Anzac is. That's a shame. I feel bad. If America was never a thing, the comments wouldn't exist now. That's true. Comments wouldn't exist. Comments would be gone. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If there's anything you can think of, go ahead and go in the comment section and leave it down there, because I'm running my brain through all these different scenarios and stuff, and I'm just like, there's no way that it's as simple as, oh, we would have gotten to World War II and then, you know, it would have been a still. Like, I feel like there's way too many things in place. For all we know, Hitler wouldn't have taken like root in Germany, because maybe the situation in World War I changes. Maybe World War I ends in a stalemate or something. So Germany doesn't get hit as hard with the Treaty of Versailles, which doesn't allow the situation to be so desperate that Hitler's able to take advantage and get power. Like, it just seems like there's too many scenarios there. So let me know what you all think in the comment section down below. Just think of any type of thing that's happened between the American Revolution and the World Wars, and just how, like, just changing certain things could have completely flipped everything, from the concept of America not existing. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. I'm still going to react to part 2 in the future. I want to see how this ends. But yeah, I'm gonna give you the deuces, and I'm signing out. If I haven't said this already, you can get to the Infographics channel. There will be a link that pops up over here that takes you to their channel. You can watch, subscribe, like all the other good stuff on their channel. In the description box down below, I will have a link that you can use to take you to the original video in case you want to watch it without me pausing and talking over it, or if you want to do a reaction to it yourself, maybe you're a reactor and you'd like to get in on it. That's the link that you would use to get the raw video. And you know, if you feel like being a good person, then you can always watch the video using the original link, despite the fact that you've seen the reaction. That way you can give the original content creator a view, and that will go a long way to helping fund future videos and stuff as well. So that's something that you can always choose to do. Now, until then, I want to see if what's the name of that YouTube channel with the characters that are shaped like blocks? I want to see if they did a video on this subject. Damn, how come I don't know I'm having a blank on the channel's name, but I know y'all know what I'm talking about. If you think back to like history related channels and the channel with the characters that look like South Park characters, you know what I'm talking about. I wonder if they did a video on this. But anyway, I'm gonna give you the deuces, and I'm signing out. Deuces.